Atheist Nomads, episode 229. Opening arguments and other legal mumbo-jumbo.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin. Lauren is listening in and might speak up, but she's, well, mostly sleeping. We are, at this point, recording on October 22 for release on December 12. Kylie should be born by this point. This would be the last episode where that's a question. On by the next one, if she isn't coming on her own, then they'll induce and make sure that all happens. But at this point, it's still a maybe. So check the Facebook page or Twitter to find out if what's happened there. But Lauren and I are on parental leave, and so that's why we're recording early. And I do have a brief sponsor message. Atheist Nomads is proudly brought to you by Archway Hosting. Check out their low-price, full-featured hosting solutions at archwayhosting.com. That's ARCHWAY hosting.com. We're also brought to you by listeners just like you. You can find out more at patreon.com/atheistnomads. And we are now welcoming P. Andrew Torrez, Esquire, of the Opening Arguments podcast, an all-around awesome legal podcaster extraordinaire. Andrew, welcome.
Dustin, thank you very much for having me on the show, for that great introduction. Prospective congratulations, which will be retrospective congratulations on Kylie by the time that this episode airs. And I apologize profusely for having already put your co-host to sleep. So.
Oh, that's okay. She was got up for breakfast and then went and laid down to take a nap, and then I woke her up to come record, and yeah, she's falling back asleep. So
yeah. Well, it happens.
Apparently, you have a very nice, soothing voice.
There you go. That is the absolute kindest way to spin it. So I'm gonna take that one. So
I think if you end up needing to do another podcast, like if you find you have copious amounts of free time that you need to invest somewhere, start a
good hypothetical. But keep going.
Start the Andrew Puts You to Sleep podcast.
There you go.
And just read legal texts.
I try and infuse, because every once in a while, and by every once in a while, I mean usually, 2 or 3 times an episode on Opening Arguments, I'll have to read kind of a lengthy block quotation, and I try and infuse that into, with some proper emphasis and, to keep people involved. But I get it. I'm trying to bring law to the masses, and it's sometimes a Sisyphean task, but it's been fun. I'm doing my best. I apologize for the soporific effect. So.
Oh no, you do an amazing job, and you make even the most arcane and horrible of legal concepts palatable.
Well, thanks. I wasn't fishing for compliments, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let's talk about something other than me, so I can feel slightly less awkward.
Well, let's talk about your podcast. What is Opening Arguments?
So the idea behind Opening Arguments is to take issues that are in the news or that are in the public consciousness that have a legal component to them, that are being reported, and if they're being reported, they're almost certainly being misreported. And kind of explain what's going on. So, a really, really good illustration is this actually just happened earlier this week. It's going to be a little bit dated news, but since it's happened 3 times over the course of 2017, I feel like it won't be that dated by the time this show airs. But 2 more courts have issued injunctions blocking the 3rd iteration of President Trump's executive order restricting immigration from certain countries. Those, in order to understand what that means, you have to understand a couple threshold legal concepts. And that's not that hard, but not a lot of people understand what that is. And in particular, look, like we're going through an age of contraction in print journalism, right? So the New York Times legal desk editor and reporters that write for it don't, they're not lawyers. They may have been writing about cases for a long time, but when you ask them, okay, what's the difference between issuing a preliminary injunction and ruling on the case on the merits, right? You wouldn't expect a journalist to know that, right? You wouldn't expect anybody to know that. So
right.
That's what we try and do. My co-host, Thomas Smith, legitimately the best interviewer I have ever met, and that counts professional interviews that I have done. He's just fantastic at it. He's been podcasting for a very, very, very long time. And he asks the questions and the follow-up as a non-lawyer from that perspective that it just wouldn't occur to me. Like, wait, you mean not everybody knows what standing in federal court means? And so he keeps me grounded and keeps the show accessible to everyone. It's fantastic. We're both left of center. We're both atheists. We're both kind of active in the atheist and skeptical communities. So it's not exclusively an atheist show, but that's part of what I like about what I think about atheist activism is normalizing atheism in larger communities, right? Mm-hmm. So, we have capital A, capital L atheist lawyers who are out there, right? Andrew Seidel from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I've had him on the show twice, right? Like, he's a great guy. He litigates First Amendment issues about atheism. That's his job. I'm trying to be small a, small L, right? I am a lawyer. I'm a small business lawyer. I'm a commercial litigator and corporate lawyer. I do the kinds of normal things that lawyers do, but I'm also a proud out atheist, and I like having that role, right? Mm-hmm. I am there to work with my clients on a day-to-day basis, and to show them and to show the world when we do the show, hey, atheists are not, we're not scary. We're out there, and we're a part of everywhere you can imagine. So that's kind of how I view the intersection.
That's an important part of the atheist movement progressing. You've got shows like Atheist Nomads that is specifically a show for atheists about issues of interest to atheists. And that is important and was especially important 5.5 years ago when this show started. And it's natural for the next step to be shows more like yours, where it's atheists doing shows that aren't about atheism, but are open and honest about the fact they are atheists and they are going at it from the perspective of an atheist.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. I mean, most people know that I do work with Puzzle and a Thunderstorm, the guys that produce Scathing Atheist, Skeptocrat, God Awful Movies, and Citation Needed. And I got involved with that as a fan of the show, like long before, not long, 6 months before, but before I was doing my own show, before I was really a part of the podcasting subset of the atheist community. I came about just, I was a fan of their show, and it was interesting because it was coming at a time in my life where, I'm over the age of 40. I'm married. My son's about to turn 15. Turns 15 tomorrow, actually.
Oh,
which
nice.
Will be 6 weeks early by the time this podcast airs. I'm a professional. I'm a part of the business. All of that. So at a time in which I'm far less scathing in my atheism mm-hmm. on a personal level, right? But it was the first time when I listened to Scathing Atheist. It was the first time I was like, and there was a diatribe that Noah gave. In talking about why he doesn't have religious apologists come on the show to, sort of debate or give equal time or whatever. And I was listening, and essentially Noah's point was, this isn't a debate show, right? This is a show by atheists to help reinforce our community. And you got a million of those for your Christian, and we have several dozen that are debate shows that want a better engagement. But like, as far as we know, there are only a handful out there that are kind of reaching out and building and reinforcing, this community where we can get together and like, every time we talk, we don't have to re-debate about like why intelligent design is stupid or, why the earth isn't 6,000 years old or whatever. Like we can move from there and just point and laugh in order to maintain our sanity in a world that sometimes desperately needs that. And I was struck by that, and I was like, wow, that's a great addition. So extending that, right? Like, I love the fact, and I heard you sort of draw a contrast. I don't know that I would say it's an evolution from 1 to 2. Like, I think as a community, we need shows like Atheist Nomads, right? Like, it is shows that reinforce the community within that community, and then shows that have outreach, and that you can listen to even if you're not a member of the tribe, so to speak.
Right.
So,
well,
so I like both together. And
part of it is just the sheer numbers. 6-7 years ago, there was 5 atheist podcasts.
Right.
By 4 years ago, there were 20 or 30, maybe even 40 or 50. And now there's a couple hundred.
Yeah.
It's just natural for the progression for, as more people want to get into that space, the space needs to get bigger to accommodate more people. Otherwise, we're all competing for the same limited audience. And it's awesome that there are now shows like yours out there.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, thank you. And sort of the last thing I would say on the kind of podcasting area is something Noah said very, very early on that stuck with me, and that I try and live by. And that is, he said, we view other podcasts out there, other atheist podcasts, as the community and not the competition. And he didn't just say that, right? Like, when I launched Opening Arguments, yes, I launched with Thomas Smith. We had the backing of what was then Atheistically Speaking, what's now called Serious Inquiries Only. We launched with an installed base from his audience, but we immediately got help by being on Scathing Atheist and being on Cognitive Dissonance. And those guys supported us 100%. They continue to support us, and we would never have gotten to where we are without their willingness to help and to say, yeah, we're not, we would love for you to be successful. We view that as expanding our community, not potentially taking away our listeners. And I was struck by the sentence, and obviously words are words, by the behavior coming out of that. And I try, I try and live up to what Noah said, but that was my lesson. That was my introduction to podcasting in the atheist community and how to think about it. And it's really stuck with me.
Very nice. Very nice. With you personally, were you raised religious?
Yeah, I was. I grew up in a household. It took me until becoming an atheist and doing research, because, as we all know, atheists know far more about religious doctrine than religious adherents. That's not just opinion; that's fact established by poll after poll and survey after survey. So I grew up Lutheran, which, again, didn't know until in my 20s is considered a really conservative Protestant sect. My recollection, and again, I was a kid, so take it with I think I was at a liberal, despite it being both Lutheran and Missouri Synod, which is the more conservative branch of a conservative sect. I wasn't a hell and brimstone kind of church. There wasn't a lot of conservative theology. I can't say I ever liked church. Does any child like church, right? But, it wasn't, there wasn't anything that was there that was grating on the conscience. And I had flirted around with, when I was in high school, I spent 6 to 9 months with a fundamentalist Christian religious organization called Young Life. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's exactly what it sounds like. And they, sort of recruit kids, and you sing songs and then listen to conservative theological religious messages. It's a pretty horrible thing. And I did that because I was in early high school. I was unpopular, and I was invited to come along, and I was like, oh, look, I'm going to make friends. And it turned out to be that. And that kind of did hit my conscience. So I think I had some sense of, what a conservative theological message was. I don't feel like I got a lot of it. But whatever, it was part of the landscape. This was in the, 1980s. It back then, there was not, you had Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian, but like you did not have an atheist movement visibility. The questions, even in Maryland, were, where do you go to church? What religion are you? Not, is religion true? Is any of this true? Do you believe any of it? It was just, you had, and even as a child, you were expected to have a religious identity. And my identity was, we're Lutheran. We get a Holy Nativity down the street. The minute I was like 14 or 15. It was late my junior year, beginning of my senior year of high school. And I was asked the question for the first time on a speech and debate trip of, well, have you ever thought about whether any of this is true? And I was like, no, I haven't. And then like by the end of the day, I was like, no, I have. And clearly this is all nonsense. Nice. So it was really like kind of a one day thing, and it was 100% philosophical. Right. And, and then from that, that was the end of my senior year. We were really busy. We were not, my parents had kind of waned and waxed. We were not always every week churchgoers by that point anyway. I was like, I stuck around. My sister had her confirmation. I went to that. Like it didn't, there was no like huge religious burden to get over. When I told my parents in college, because of course you go away to college and then, you come back, and I was always kind of I was not, this will not surprise you that I was a child who was rather willing to express my beliefs to my parents from an early age. And I came back and, there was some time in college where I'm an atheist and I'm not going to church with you anymore, or whatever. And then, that caused some typical family stuff that we have long since worked through and put past. And so I realize I apologize for that, like, ridiculously long answer to a very, very simple question. But
that was
I think you knew that.
That was a perfectly length answer to what I had in mind with the question. I just didn't have to ask any follow-ups.
I think you knew what you were getting into when you invited me on the show.
Oh yeah, So what's interesting is like from my perspective, Lutherans are moderate Christians, not conservative.
Oh, okay.
Because when you put them in the broader spectrum, you've got your Baptists and Pentecostals and Adventists and the non-denominational batshit crazy evangelicals. That's conservative Christianity. You've got your Church of Christ and Episcopalians and Methodists. Well, maybe Methodists on the liberal side, and like Lutherans. Most Methodists and some of those groups kind of fit in that middle ground of, for the most part, they're not crazy and want everybody to burn in hell, assuming they even believe in a hell.
Well, look, Lutheran Missouri Synod at least is there is a real hell. You have So there is there's that element. The other thing is, keep in mind, when I was growing up, Seventh-day Adventists were not. They were not a blip on the radar, and the non-denominational. If you go look up the history, I'm sure you may be able to find mega churches that were in existence in 1985. But nothing like today, right? It was not, they were not a force on the landscape. Like I remember Robert Schuller had the Crystal Cathedral in Virginia, and that was right. Everybody, the reason I remember it is because it was part of the public consciousness, because it was such a weird thing, right? Mm-hmm. So the rise of, it's kind of an Overton window for religious denominations, right? Like the rise of this non-denominational conservative evangelical Christianity has, I think, pushed that window far to the right. So all that's a way of saying, I think, you may be right in describing it now, but certainly, at the time, Southern Baptist is not, and Pentecostals are not a strong part of the landscape in the Northeast either. So,
True.
Of the landscape of religious denominations, going through and looking and being like, where do you rank vis-a-vis, Congregationalist, Church of Christ, Methodist, Protestant, PCUSA. I was like, we're to the right of that, to the right of that, to the right of that, to the right. So that was the perception that I had. But I agree. Your point is well taken today.
Yeah. And what's interesting is with that timing in the 1980s, that's when, the Adventist Church was moving their headquarters to D.C. and at that point actually moved it to Washington, D.C. And then they moved a little bit later to Silver Spring, Maryland, because cheaper land.
I lived down the street from them for 20 years.
Okay.
I used to live in Montgomery County.
But they were intentionally trying to stay below the radar up into the 80s because starting in the 1950s, they were concerned about being viewed as a cult, so they wanted to look as mainstream and normal as possible. And it wasn't until about the 80s that they finally started thinking, okay, no, we need to actually start looking a little bit more distinctive so we can better recruit people. Yeah.
And that is the distinctive political and religious movement of our time. And by our time, I mean now the past 50 years, which is 40 odd, but beginning in the early 1970s as a response to the emerging modern secularism of any sensible modern industrial and post-industrial society, all of a sudden you had the history of these religious splinter groups moving towards ecumenicalism and saying, look, we're going to organize and fight together because when we're all whacked up as tiny little parcels, we are going to lose space in a pluralistic society to people who are secular and to now what we call the nuns, right? Like, and in the 1970s, obviously, no organized atheists, but you believe that religious people like religious business professionals like Jerry Falwell were looking at a situation going, the number of people who identify as Christians but go to church 3 times a year is staggering, right? And that's staggering because they are counted as being on the rolls of our church, but they're not there every week giving us their money. They're giving us, 3 times a year. That's not enough. And I firmly believe they saw, that kind of crowd. I don't think they foresaw an atheist movement, but they foresaw those forces in society tending to minimize is the wrong word, minimize religious participation in public life. And they said, okay, it's time for us all to band together. That's when I actually just had a discussion over the etymology of the word Judeo-Christian, which does predate this. I wagered and lost. Andrew was wrong, as always, that Judeo-Christian was invented in the 1970s. It was invented prior to that, but exploded into use in the 1970s, where all of a sudden these right-wing fundamentalist Christian groups all of a sudden decided, hey, look, we're not going to pick our fights with the Catholics. We're not going to pick our fights with the Jews. We're not going to pick our fights with other Christian denominations. Mormons were still on the no-go list, but yeah, and all of a sudden, you had a complete realignment where, one of the things that will break your heart is pull up literature from the 1950s and the 1960s on the separation of church and state, and you will find almost every subsect of Christianity was pro-separation of church and state because all of them were afraid of the other one getting the upper hand, right? You will find some wishy-washiness in heavily Catholic areas from Catholic leaders, right? And that's to be expected because that's a religion that's doctrine is comes down from a theocratic state, right? So and with separation of church and state, you had areas with a sizable Catholic population. Everybody was afraid of the Catholics.
in areas with a sizable Mormon population. Everybody was afraid of the Mormons. And I think it was really those two groups. Everybody wanted to make sure they wouldn't ever be in charge.
Exactly. That is exactly. And so you see almost every Protestant denomination, including Baptists, right, including the ones you would put on the far conservative side of the spectrum in the 1950s and 1960s, filing amicus briefs in the Supreme Court in favor of a stricter view of church-state separation, distributing literature that was sort of pro-separation of church and state, and obviously that's all been abandoned to a political strategy that has been monstrously effective over the past 4 decades.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it also just comes down to 1950s, we had McCarthyism, where if it's A, godless, it must be communist, and B, if it's in any way identifiable as not American, it's dangerous. And authorities in Rome, that's un-American.
Oh, that's a really interesting perspective. That's not one I've thought of, because the predicate that you were setting up is something I have talked about before, which is a lot of people are surprised that kind of like at the height of the godless McCarthyite era, when we've added God to the Pledge of Allegiance and, we are reaffirming the sort of Christian nation status, that you nevertheless had that was not the genesis for, the modern day religious right, that the religious groups are sort of working on saying, well, hey, look, like, yes, obviously we're going to have a Christian identity because we're not godless communists. But at the same time, there was a notion of, and that Christian identity is sort of separate from any particular sect and is bounded by American traditions, ideals, and institutions. And one of those traditions, ideals, and institutions is the notion of separation of church and state. Yeah. You could have plucked a pastor off the street anywhere USA in 1955 and said, tell me what the First Amendment says about religion, and he, and it obviously would have been a he in 1955, would say, yeah, that's separation of church and state. Like, you keep your government off my church stays out of your government. And and we've lost that.
And I think a big part of where it started to change was with the election of Kennedy. Because one of the biggest objections to him as a candidate was the fact he was Catholic. That was more concerning than his age or his politics or his experience level or his hooking up with movie stars.
Well, which was all kept quiet. But look at that, right? So, yeah, that was an issue, and it was an issue that was openly discussed in the presidential election of 1960. Consider how it was addressed, right? Kennedy's speech on his Catholicism remains a landmark speech today, and it begins with, "I believe in an America in which the separation of church and state is absolute." I defy you to find. I mean, you could get 3, 8, that we have a dozen politicians in this country who maybe would say that, but and 2 of them proudly here in Maryland, in Jamie Raskin, who's the U.S. representative from my old district, the 8th District of Maryland, and I think I've talked to Chris Van Hollen's staff, and he's he identifies as religious of some sort, but he's definitely been a friend to the non-religious. So U.S. Senator from Maryland, but you think, I mean, there are, of the 47 Democrats in the Senate, if you think you can get 10 to stand up on the floor of the Senate and say, I believe in an America in which the separation of church and state is absolute, I'll take the under on that. Right?
Oh yeah.
And that was a popular, Republicans who voted for Kennedy wanted to hear Kennedy say, I believe in an America in which the separation of church and state is absolute.
And the Democrats that voted for him, including the racists in the South, wanted to hear that as well.
Yep.
And yeah, and then as that ended up solidifying Catholics are Christian too. It wasn't just Protestant America; it was Christian America until 2012, when the Mormons finally got brought in.
Yeah, no, and that's right. I remember when Billy Graham endorsed younger Billy, because I think the older Billy Graham is like 174 now, but younger Billy Graham, who runs the Billy Graham Ministries, endorsed Mitt Romney, and there was a minor kind of kerfuffle because they went and deleted the page of Mormons are cults off of the Billy Graham website. That I don't know. I would say that integration is still partial at best.
Oh yeah,
but you partial at best from a theological perspective. But certainly you had no right. That was the clinching proof to anybody on the outside who wanted to make an evaluation that the religious right is a political movement first, foremost, and always, because they had no problems ginning up the religious right machine to try and elect a Mormon in 2012, and obviously confirmed. And I say this, I am passing on. I don't know if you listen to Penn Jillette's podcast.
I don't know.
So Penn was obviously atheist. Was a multiple, at least a two-time contestant on the Celebrity Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice All Stars, right? So he has spent considerable time with Donald Trump, and during the election, was talking about it and said. There was a little bit of coded language because that show has lawyers advising it, so I totally understand why they did this. But made it very, very clear on the show that Donald Trump is an atheist, right? And I don't. That's not a hard thing to imagine. Mm-hmm. And so I take that as fairly good evidence that Donald Trump is an atheist, and is a good illustration, of why of why atheists are, in terms of I would not vote for the first obviously atheist presidential candidate, and in any event, whether he's an atheist or just like the worst possible Christian, there was no problem ginning up the entire fundamentalist Christian conservative right to vote for Donald Trump. And indeed, that's the only major segment in our society of voting blocks that still has an over 50% approval rating for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That's it. And how, I would love to have a true believer who is willing to talk honestly, who identifies as Christian, conservative, Trump supporter, and I would just love to figure that out.
Yeah,
but that's a hard conversation to have. So
right, especially since the ones that are the loudest are so insane. Your Pat Robertson and Jim Bakers. They love Trump and they're nuts.
But Pat Robertson is, Pat Robertson's father was a Democratic senator from Virginia. He is a political creature through and through. He ran for president briefly. Pat Robertson ran for president in 1988. There was no right talking to that person is of zero value. And Jim Baker is a bucket salesman. So I agree. There's not a conversation to be had there. If you want to break your heart on Serious Inquiries Only, Thomas Smith, my partner from Opening Arguments, interviewed Robert M. Price. This is 20 or 30 episodes ago. You can look it up in the back catalog. If you just type Serious Inquiries Only, Robert M. Price, you'll pull it up. And Bob Price is a legitimate biblical scholar. He's one of the few that sort of have the mythicist Jesus position, and he's very, very smart when it comes to the Bible. He's also a long-standing hardcore right-wing Republican and avid Trump supporter, and Thomas brought him on to discuss. So why'd you support Trump? Are you still supporting Trump? And it was a hard conversation, and just the level of sort of imperviousness to facts from somebody who otherwise, right, has no problem. I mean, like, here's somebody, who in Price, who has whose mantra is, hey, look, I realize that I am way outside the mainstream when it comes to biblical scholarship. I realize everybody else has come to the opposite conclusion, but take a look at consider this, and wait, and tell me how you come out, right? Like, that's always his approach, right? He's not kind of dogmatic about mythicism. His position is, it deserves a place at the table in conversation. And so there is somebody who, has made his latter career about encouraging people to be open-minded about, things everybody knows to be the case. And yet when it came to political things, right? I mean, it was just repeating things that are obvious, Fox News talking points about Barack Obama that are just, 30 seconds of Googling would show that they're not true,
right.
And yet there was zero critical reflection. It was 100% a kind of emotional, will I get, and so, he said, so for example, one of the things he said was, the Price said was, well, obviously, like, Trump's been a hugely successful business person. And Thomas said, well, can we drill down a little bit on, for example, the studies that compare the rate of return of the vast sum of money that he inherited versus, what Trump's actually been able to do with it. And he scoffed, and he was like, if you're going to tell me that Trump is not a successful business person, I don't know why I'm on here wasting my time. Right. Like, what can you say to that when somebody says there's nothing you can tell me that will, that will get me to reverse my consideration,
Yeah.
Like,
wow.
I don't know. I don't know what to do at that point.
Well, like, one of the things I got a lot of flack for with episode 210, we had Lauren L. from Republican Atheists on. Oh, yeah. And she's a Price advocate.
Yes,
so. He's on her board.
Yeah, right. I think he is her board.
Basically, so. Yeah. A lot of criticism I got was for not taking her to task enough for the things that she was saying, when the things she was saying were so absurd that I didn't think it was even necessary.
I get that sometimes, in the law, there are two different times that you really interact with potential witnesses. So the first time is in depositions, and a deposition, particularly in the civil realm, the procedure's different in criminal cases, and I don't do criminal cases, so I can't really speak to it. But in a civil case, you take depositions of the other party's key witnesses, and a deposition is the witness, her lawyer, you as the lawyer taking the deposition, and a stenographer in the room. There's no judge. There's nobody to rule. And by and large, what you do, unless you hit an impasse, is the other side's lawyers will put objections on the record. But unless you get to an impasse of where, like, so for example, if I were to ask a question that's like, okay, so, Ms. Smith, what did your lawyer tell you today? The lawyer is going to say objection, and I instruct the witness not to answer because that's attorney-client privilege, and she's never going to talk about that. And if I say, well, no, I'm going to ask her about it, then you have to you literally have to get a judge on the phone to make a ruling on the spot, or you have to, suspend the deposition, move to compel and move forward. But leaving aside that weird situation, which has happened to me twice in 21 years of practice, leaving that aside, by and large, the deposition has no third party. You're just creating a record. And what you do as a lawyer in a deposition is you want to give the witness as much rope as possible with which to hang themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So you ask open-ended questions and you say, oh, yeah, tell me more about that, right? Like you encourage the witness to talk as much as possible because everything they're saying pins them down in terms of their story, right? But you don't go for the jugular and try and show the conviction. The conviction is the wrong word. You don't try and show the contradictions during the deposition for the most part because you want to save that for trial. You want to be like, okay, if you're going to call this witness at trial and she's going to testify as to X, I've got her on record in her deposition saying not X. So now I've blocked out that witness. And then the second way, the way in which most people who aren't lawyers are familiar with lawyers interacting with witnesses, because you watch Law and Order, is at trial and you've cornered in its cross-examination and you're like, isn't it true, Miss Smith, that you have consistently said that the property line, and in those cases, yes, you are aggressive and combative and you're trying to impeach the credibility of the witness. I don't believe all of that as setup is a way of saying, I don't believe that most podcast interactions, even hostile podcast interactions, are suited to the cross-examination model.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would much rather have... So I have to concede. I apologize. I haven't listened to that episode. I want to go back and listen because every time I heard Lauren on cognitive dissonance and it was a train wreck. And so I suspect that there may be some, rubbernecking entertainment potential.
What's funny is one of the criticisms I got was that I was too soft on her. I called her a racist, a xenophobe, and said that she, even though she's claiming to be a humanist, that she obviously isn't.
Yeah.
And that's soft.
But my friend Eli Bosnick has a really terrific style in these kinds of hostile interviews, having just done one with the Mythicist Milwaukee organizers, in which when somebody says something appalling, he will say, sometimes he'll say nothing. Sometimes he'll say, well, that was an appalling thing to say. And when there's a pushback, he'll say, well, look, I think we'll just let the audience figure that one out.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that kind of construction, right? Like in my view, you do not have to, sort of call out and say, when somebody says something horrible, like, you don't want to be saying, well, right on, that's a great point. but I don't know that it benefits you to say, to be hostile and shut it down when, you can sort of be like, oh, okay, yeah, like, are you sure? Like, I'm giving you a chance to recant on that. What do you think about it? And then it's really, really difficult for people to play the, well, that's out of context, or, well, I didn't mean it, or, well, it was ambiguous. Like you get the cleanest record of what people believe when you've asked them, an open-ended question, but an open-ended question that kind of, forces them into, to sort of take one or two tracks, right? So, for example, like one of the things, the definition of a leading question, the way you can tell, I want to ruin watching legal dramas and movies for everybody who's listening to the show. One of the rules people know is you can't ask leading questions on direct examination. Right? It's one of the very few things people know about trial tactics. A leading question is a question that suggests the answer in the predicate of the question, right? So when I say, isn't it true that you were in my basement last night? That's a leading question, right? The question, were you in my basement last night, is not a leading question, right?
Okay.
Where were you last night is an open-ended, non-leading question, right? So when you hear when you hear witness testimony on TV or in movies, and it is a direct, listen to hear how the lawyer is treating the witness on direct. If they are leading questions, that's an improper direct. And then cross-examination should almost always be leading questions, right? So that's typically how you have it. All of that was just sort of a predicate to I don't favor leading questions in interviews, even in sort of hostile interviews / debates. What I favor is the open-ended question that constrains you to a particular path, right? So, for example, do you think it's a violation of church and state, of the principle of separation of church and state, to give money directly from the federal government to religious coffers, right? And if I ask that of somebody, that's it. I don't have to say answer yes or no, right? Like I don't have to phrase it as a hostile leading question. they're either going to say, yes, it is, or they're going to say, no, it isn't. And then I can think of, in advance, like, okay, well, if they say yes, how am I going to use that to set up my argument? If they say no, how am I going to use that to set up my argument? Right. So the more, right, the key, in my view anyway, in conducting a deposition, in setting people up, even in, sort of preparation for anything but kind of the most aggressive cross-examination, is to sort of plan out in advance, like, okay, well, what if they say yes to this? What if they say no? What if they say no to the follow-up? And once you know kind of where all the potential roads are, then, you can block out and sort of anticipate where they're going.
Yeah.
And yet you've given the witness complete freedom to answer however they want. Right. And yeah, like, you have to make sure your questions, right? So, for example, if they're trying to be slippery and you've asked is it a violation, and they say maybe, then you say, okay, well, tell me what you mean by maybe, right? Not a classic cross-examination question, but again, that pins down. They'll say, okay, so maybe, right, if it's coming directly from, tax, from general tax revenues, then it does. But if, then what you do is you listen to the maybe, and you rephrase it, and you say, okay, I just want to make sure I understand you. So you're saying if it comes from general tax revenues, then it is. But if it's like, something that is, only affected by taxes, then it's not, whatever. In other words, you get them to draw the distinction for you, and you just keep going back to the original question,
right,
until you get your yes, no.
Well, and I've been cross-examined in a felony trial once, and it was painful and mean. Yep. Absolutely.
Sorry.
Just straight up cruel. It was, so the crime that I'd witnessed, I couldn't actually speak to, because the victim did not press charges, because he wasn't going to press charges against the leader of his gang. So I couldn't say anything about the fact that I watched the defendant hit someone across the face with the butt of his pistol. The only thing I could say was that I saw him with the gun get into the car and head down the road. And the defense attorney asked, all right, where did the car go? Well, headed north on Orchard. Okay, which direction did they leave out of the parking lot? Well, he turned left. Wait, no, actually, he turned right. There is no left turn involved in the maneuver that I just described. And he just, I think there was a couple other questions in there to try to pin down on, like, getting me to the exact movements of the car.
Right.
I got so confused and flipped around, and oh man, when you're on the witness stand, bright lights on you, and you're getting asked, did he go left or right? It was 9 months before. Right.
Exactly. And it is, I did a somewhat controversial episode of Opening Arguments in which I was not surprised that this came up, that, we're a legal podcast. So fans had been asking for a long time, what's your opinion of the most famous legal podcast on the planet, Serial? And I gave my opinion, and then got called a racist by 10,000 fans of the Undisclosed podcast. That was fun. But ultimately, one of the things I said on that show was that the Serial podcast, and Undisclosed in particular, which is a follow-up, sort of even more strongly, the person who runs it is Adnan, the defendant's childhood best friend's sister, right? So it was paid for by his legal defense fund, right? So I'm just very clear, and they disclose that in there, in fairness to them.
Okay,
but nevertheless,
so
it's a defense brief.
Actually disclose things.
Yes, precisely. And so one of the things that I said that I think will resonate with you, given your experience, was, look, I'm not super impressed by picking apart details and showing that they don't necessarily hang together, particularly at a trial that is 2 years after the event, and even more so on a podcast that is 15 years after the event, because of the way that human memory works, and because of the way that lawyers behave in court, right? Like, so, you always, one of the easiest things to do is to try and, impeach the reliability of the witness by suggesting that they're not, reliable on, these kinds of, and it's like, well, Mr. Williams, if you can't remember whether the car went left or right, how can you possibly have anything of value to offer in this trial, and so as a result of that, like that kind of, sort of nitpicking on details, even where you find a legitimate contradiction, as a lawyer, it doesn't impress me a whole lot, right? Mm-hmm. Because I know how easy it is to do that. I know how easy it is to take somebody and fluster them on the stand, because I do it all the time. Yeah. So, and I gave an example of a case that I thought was fairly analogous, even though it was a civil case, right? Not a criminal, so, different stakes or whatever. And we had two pieces of evidence that were entered. This was we were reconstructing a 1970s contract in the 1990s, right? Okay. And we introduced two separate piece of evidence. One was minutes from a meeting that clearly took place in London with all the parties that were signed. Everybody agreed these minutes took place. And those took place, I'm making up the date, June 13th, 1974, right? And we also introduced the other side, but collectively the parties, they introduced a mimeographed, or because this is 1974, a copy of an agenda for the CEO who was present at that June 13th, 1974 meeting, that from his secretary that said, Mr. So-and-so, you are going to travel to Boston on June 12th. You're going to be staying at the Marriott, and you'll be there through June 16th, returning to London on June 17th in the morning. Here's your itinerary or whatever. So if you believe both of those things, right, then you have to throw them both out. They're obviously, the CEO couldn't have been at the meeting while on a plane to Boston. But at the end of the day, we never figured out what that other document was, right? Could it have been an itinerary the secretary prepared and then threw away because the CEO came back and said, no, I've got this important meeting here in London on the 13th? Could have been. Could it have been for a flight in 1975 that they typoed 1974 and, because it was on carbon paper or whatever technology they used to copy things in the 1970s, never got corrected, right? There are a million other plausible, alternative explanations. We never figured it out, right? But everybody knew that that wasn't going to be enough to keep out the other side. I mean, obviously the other side was trying to introduce it to impeach the meeting notes, but there was so much corroborating evidence on the meeting notes, right? It was clear that meeting had took place. So yeah, there's this one anomalous piece of information, but that doesn't invalidate kind of the overall weight of the evidence. Right. So anyway, that's a huge rabbit trail, but just in thinking about,
And with the trial that I was a witness for, what was interesting was the biggest part of what they were trying to convict him of, I had absolutely no knowledge of outside of the reports that I'd read looking up, information about the case. And that was the 20 pounds of cocaine.
I'm surprised they didn't ask you about that, because you're well, anyway, keep going.
Right. Sorry. So in the end, they found 20 pounds of cocaine in the trunk of the car. And so the biggest crime they were going for was possession with intent to sell. The second biggest was the unlawful possession of a firearm, because he was already a convicted felon. And I was tying him to the gun that got thrown out of the window of the car during the police chase, and tying him to the car where they found the cocaine. And so it was so weird in that, I was at the early part of it, the crime I saw, I couldn't talk to, but I was tying him to the vehicle that the police eventually found, because they didn't arrest him out of the car. He jumped out and ran, and they had to chase him down, but still had to tie him to the car. It was bizarre.
Well, that's something, again, where people are kind of familiar with the court system from TV shows. It is very, very common. The reason why complex criminal cases last a long time is because you do exactly what you've just described with your witnesses, right? Which is to say, you bring on different witnesses to establish different key facts in the chain. You very rarely have, one witness that is sort of the linchpin to the whole thing, right? Okay, like, what are we going to... Yeah, we'll get 3 people that said he got into a white car, right? And then, you might look at it and go, that's going to be pretty obvious then. It's going to be difficult if it's 3 disinterested bystanders, right? Like, that's going to establish that fact in the jury's mind. So, okay, so we're going to show that he got into a white car at 12 o'clock. And then we're going to show he was arrested a mile away from a white car at 12:30, right? And you're going to leave it to the jury, to draw. If you can't establish where he was between 12 and 12:30, you've got to leave it to the inference of the jury, right? You got to be like, look, he was in a white car. We found the white car. Yeah, he wasn't in it when we found it, but did Dustin really have a motive to lie in this case? Did the other 2 eyewitnesses have a motive to lie? No. Like, we know what happened, right? And that's and so the length of a trial, particularly complex, it's true also in commercial cases, is because you bring on the witnesses because everybody has a tiny little part of the story to tell, and nobody has the whole story to tell. So
yeah, and it was 3 witnesses tying him to the gun and the car. Yeah, the police were the only witnesses for the rest of it. And right. Yeah, anyway, this is definitely a rabbit trail. Still a fascinating one.
Yeah, but it's fun. It's fun, and it's fun for me anyway.
Well, and it just shows how, when it comes to facts of did an event happen and how did that happen and who was involved, it's a lot more complicated than it seems to a casual observer.
Yeah. And look, I mean, we have had solid psychological research for 50 years as to just how reliable and just how unreliable eyewitness testimony is. I mean, most people you can say like, like the bear suit thing, right? Which refers to a prominent, you can take it on YouTube, but there is there's a test. I'm going to spoil it for you if you haven't heard it or if your listeners haven't heard it, but you are asked to count the number of passes in a basketball game. It is designed to show inattention blindness, right? And it says, okay, we're going to test you. It's a 15-second clip. Tell me, how many times do the Lakers pass the ball to each other, and dribble the ball or whatever, right? And you sit there, and then it comes back up and says, after the 15 seconds, and says, did you notice the guy in the bear suit strolling across the middle of the court? And you go back and rewind it and play it, and literally, when you're not focused on counting the bouncing baskets, you see, and it's slow, right? Like, you see a guy in a bear suit walk through the middle of this basketball game, and you ask yourself, how could I have possibly missed that? And the answer, is based on the way our brain and our eyes interact. It's called inattention blindness. You're so hyper focused on counting the bounce passes that you miss the guy in the bear suit. Yeah. And that's just, sort of one example that, again, is just, it's well known, throughout all fields that people aren't good at this stuff.
Right. And the sooner you can fill out the police report and the more detailed you can be in it, the better off you'll be. Because they handed me a copy of my police report. Don't take legal advice from this podcast, but that is good advice. Okay, so we're running low on time, and there's a big topic that I wanted to discuss that hopefully we can get through quickly. What the fuck is going on with the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So there's a lot of really, really bad things. I will tell you my thesis, and I am looking at writing a law review article on this. I don't think I've ever articulated it in quite this form on my show or anywhere else. So kind of exclusive for you.
Nice.
Yeah. So there you go. If you ask just about any lawyer what the most shameful period in our nation's history was from the Supreme Court perspective, you can get individual decisions, right? Like everybody knows, Dred Scott was an atrocious decision. But lawyers will give you almost to a person the answer of, the Lochner era, right? And the Lochner era refers to a 1927 case called Lochner versus New York that struck down New York's minimum wage laws, right?
Okay.
And what the Lochner court did, and they said, look, businesses have a right to earn a profit and conduct a living free from government interference. So it is unconstitutional, not just, contrary to congressional mandate or whatever. It is against the Constitution for New York State to impose minimum wage laws. And you might ask yourself, what amendment is that? Like, where's that right in the Constitution? And that would be a really, really good question. And so it marks the period of extreme right-wing pro-business judicial activism from the Supreme Court. And the Lochner era court struck down business regulations left and right at a time when the influence of socialism and the deepening of the Great Depression was being strongly felt in society. And most people know, like from their history classes, the FDR's court packing plan. Mm-hmm. That was at the end of the Lochner era. And it was because obviously Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to impose restrictions on our largely unfettered capitalist economy at the time in light of what was happening on the ground. And the Lochner court kept striking down parts of the New Deal. And so the threat was basically made, look, I'm going to expand the Supreme Court, I think, to 21, right? And, I'm going to appoint 12 justices. Given the political climate, it's not going to be a problem. And those 12 justices are all going to rule my way unless this court really gets its act in gear. And that was kind of the end of the Lochner era. There were still provisions that were shut down, but the notion that businesses had an implied right to operate free from government restriction then was sort of dead thereafter.
Okay.
So that's, and I would say lawyers left and right, like we learned this first year of law school when you talk about the concepts of separation of powers and judicial activism and what does it mean? And the answer was like the Supreme Court sort of created this right out of nowhere for businesses that's not found in the Constitution. And later courts were like, we screwed that one up and moved back towards moved away from those rulings. I think this era right now has the potential to be viewed on a par with the Lochner era and in a very, very specific way that is very, very frightening to me. And it's what I want to begin drawing public attention to. And that is starting with the Hobby Lobby decision in 2014, but in particular continuing through Trinity Lutheran, which I have been decrying since it was issued. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court has created a right for institutions that never previously existed.
Wait, would the start with Citizens United?
Yeah. Well, Citizens United is a really, really complicated case. So I'm not. Okay. I want to kind of put that aside because that's going to be a huge rabbit trail to get to.
Okay.
In Hobby Lobby, what the Supreme Court said for the first time was businesses have religious beliefs. Okay.
Right.
That's the stupidest possible thing that a court can say. Right. And I say this having read an awful lot of stupid things that courts have said. A business is a profit center, right? Mm-hmm. Like my podcast is produced by Opening Arguments Media, LLC, right? It is a business. Opening Arguments Media, LLC is not a Lutheran or an atheist or Pentecostal. Right? Opening Arguments Media, LLC is an organization duly organized under the laws of the state of Maryland to receive the money from the show, right? Like businesses are profit centers. They are not religious. They don't have religious beliefs. And so for the first time, and you will search in vain to find the notion of institutions having a collective right of the sort that we otherwise attribute to people, right? Mm-hmm. So Hobby Lobby should have been organized. It could have still come down the same way. But the question the court should have answered is if people with strong religious beliefs have a corporation and want that corporation not to issue contraception, can they do so, right? That's a different question. That would have at least been, it would have been bad if it had come out the way Hobby Lobby did, but it would have at least not changed the legal landscape in the way that the analysis in Hobby Lobby did. And what put the nail in the coffin, in my view, was the Trinity Lutheran decision, in which the Supreme Court, again, 6-2 decision, right? Like, this is not, this is not a Gorsuch, this is not a 5-4, said churches have a First Amendment right to apply for neutral government programs, and it violates the First Amendment to discriminate against them as a church, as the way the Trinity Lutheran Court put it was, to force them to choose between being a church and competing for neutral government programs. Again, you will search in vain, I have done this, to find a Supreme Court case anywhere in our nation's history that says churches have rights. Mm-hmm. Churches don't have rights. Churches are organizations of individuals. Individuals have rights. That's always been the way our Constitution has been interpreted. And the notion that we are creating these new corporate institutional rights out of nothing is, I think, going to be one of the enduring legacies, shameful legacies of this court. Extending into sort of the near future, extending back the last 15 years and extending into the near future. I hope we're able to shift direction, but I think it's really radical. And the fact that nobody out there is saying this is radical, regardless of whether you agree with the outcome or not, that this is a radical departure in jurisprudence. It's unlike anything in our nation's history. That's what I'm trying to sound the alarm about.
Okay.
So,
well, one area where I can see this definitely having an impact is there's a number of cases right now involving religious hospitals refusing to provide basic medical services because of religious beliefs, getting sued for patients dying because they didn't get necessary medical care. This is going to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court, as currently constituted, is very, very likely to frame the issue, however it comes out, right? Like, this is why it's pernicious, right? Because suppose they come out in favor, narrowly 5-4 in favor of patients' rights in one case, right? Mm-hmm. And say, yes, because of the compelling... the issue is still going to be framed as the religious hospital's right to deny services versus the individual's right to demand treatment. And asking the question that way is the equivalent of the, have you stopped beating your wife question, right? Like, it's the predicate is wrong. The hospital doesn't have rights. And the notion, I mean, that's, and we are never going, if the question going forward is evaluating things in terms of, well, how do we balance, an individual right versus a religious institution's right, then we've already lost the long game, right?
Yeah.
Like, the only proper answer is to go back to what we said. Religious institutions are voluntary organizations formed by individuals with religious beliefs in order to help facilitate their beliefs. Institutions have no rights in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. Individuals have rights, right? Absolutely. People have free exercise rights. I would never want to take away an individual's right to the free exercise of their religion. But then the question is, what does that mean? And does that get magically transformed into something else because you've called yourself a church? And, this is something that, again, it's why I started off with the Lochner comparison. I think in the abstract, 30 years from now, you'll be able to ask lawyers, you'll be able to ask religious lawyers and atheist lawyers and liberal lawyers and conservative lawyers, and they'll be like, no, the Supreme Court just screwed that one up for 20 years. Sorry about that, our bad. Because that's not how these cases get analyzed. It is not, regardless of your view of the Constitution, right? If you're an originalist, if you think we need to go back to what the Founding Fathers thought, the Founding Fathers absolutely did not think that the Free Exercise Clause protected the rights of churches. Mm-hmm. Right? Zero. You will find nothing in the literature that suggests that.
It's about the rights of the believers.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Anyway, that's my impassioned rant for.
Yeah. So when the question comes to, is it a health ministry or a hospital? The current court would decide it's a ministry.
Yeah. Well, and again, right. So you're. I think you're making an allusion to a case that came out a couple of months ago that's called Advocate Healthcare Network versus Stapleton. It was a June 2017 case that was about pensions. And now, if I haven't been controversial enough already, I want to lob this one out there, because I'm going to tell you, I think Advocate Healthcare Network was rightly decided. Okay. It was an 8-0 case. Okay. And let me explain. Look, it fits into an overall pattern, and the overall pattern is still bad. And I've just spent 15 minutes telling you this has the potential to be regarded as the worst Supreme Court in our nation's history, particularly when it comes to separation of church and state issues. So hopefully my bona fides are pretty good there. But let me talk to you about the Advocate Healthcare Network case. In 1974, Congress passed a law called ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, I believe is the and basically what that was legislative protection for pensions, right? So think about like the American job market. Sort of up to that point, pensions were largely unregulated. 1970s, you had kind of the re-rise of vertically integrated near monopolies. You had commoditization of various sort of long-standing key aspects of the American job sector. You had wildly unprofitable American auto manufacturers and steel manufacturers, and you had these companies that were going bankrupt, and promises that had been made to American workers for their pensions were just were going unfulfilled. And so Congress passed ERISA that puts a whole bunch of requirements on employers that is designed to protect the pension plan. As a part of that law, however, Congress had an exemption for what they called church plans. And so they said, look, like, we mean this for, steel mills and auto manufacturing plants and everything else, but you work for a church, and that's how it was defined, right? A plan established and maintained for its employees by a church, which then had an additional codicil that said, including a plan maintained by an organization, the principal purpose of which is the administration or funding of such plan for the employees of a church, if the organization is controlled by or associated with the church. And they intended from the very beginning to exempt churches from the requirement of the ERISA law. Now, why did they intend to exempt churches? I don't know. Right. Probably there were lobbying. Again, remember, this was an era before mega churches. So you were sort of talking about, your hometown church. Are you really going to make them, require with this kind of, let's just keep the government, right? Separation of church and state. Let's keep the government out of auditing church books. And we're going to exempt churches from this law. Not how I would go about it today. But that's what Congress clearly intended. And so then the question was, do nonprofit organizations that are affiliated with a church that run hospitals qualify as principal purpose organizations? Are they religious organizations that were intended to be exempted under the 1974 ERISA Act? And based on my review of the legislative history, and based on my review of the case law, it's a close question. And like I said, there is in that case, there is a concurrence by Sonia Sotomayor that raises a red flag that says, "Hey, look, I think we've all come to the right conclusion that these organizations are principal purpose organizations, but there are some real problems with this on the landscape, and Congress should clarify what it means by ERISA, because and she doesn't say the rise of megachurches and the rise of parachurch organizations, but what she says is, boy, the landscape today looks a lot different than it does 40 years ago, and I agree with that. But I gotta tell you, I know it's unpopular. I think they got it right. I try, I try and come down, where I think the law is, and I think the court got it right in that case. So
yeah. Fortunately, in my case, I have found that my 401k is going to be automatically rolled over to a 403b, and that is not a pension, so it is not affected by that ruling.
There you go. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that for you. And again, right, I want to be very, very clear. Politically, I think it's deplorable, right? Like, no question. But I think there were some, and I love, it's part of why I've had Andrew Seidel on my show twice, and I could have him on every week. Like, I love our friendly debates back and forth, right? Because he is an advocate. He's on the front lines. He is pushing the most aggressive positions. There were some, it was, I think it was covered on Friendly Atheist, and there were some in our community that were sort of, that were looking to lump in the Advocate Healthcare Network decision kind of with this larger trend. And I think this one deserves to be separated out. I think it's a little bit unfair to lump it together. Again, not saying I'm not standing on the parapets, shouting that the Mongols are coming, because I am, right? Like, it's bad. It's going to get worse. And we have at least 3, probably 4 justices on the Supreme Court who don't believe that the First Amendment means what it clearly says it means, right? Who think that the First Amendment permits an accommodationist view of church and state, whereby the government can offer aid and comfort to religion and prefer religion to irreligion, so long as it doesn't prefer any one individual sect. That is a dangerously ahistorical and antisocial belief to have, right? It would be disastrous to the republic. So yeah, like, that's a real problem. So I don't want to lose sight of that.
All right. Well, we are out of time, Andrew.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully it's not too much of my ranting here at the end, but I do believe really strongly in these issues. So,
this was solicited ranting. So, definitely.
Yep. Well,
yeah.
You get what you get. Right?
And where can people find your show?
So, just Google Opening Arguments. We're openargs.com, openargs.com. That's also our Twitter handle. We have a great Facebook community. Just look it up. It's, we're pretty easy to find, and thank you for letting me plug the show. Thanks for having me on.
Alrighty. Thank you. And for our listeners, remember, not all those who wander are lost. Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/atheistnomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.